Hey guys, tonight we venture into the frozen halls of Winterfell and beyond to uncover the complete saga of House Stark, from the legendary Bran the Builder who raised the wall itself to Jon Snow's final journey beyond it. 8,000 years of honor, betrayal, love, and loss woven through the very fabric of Westeros itself. The wolves of the north, whose howls have echoed through every age, whose blood has been spilled on battlefields from the Trident to the walls of King's Landing, and whose legacy shaped the fate of 7 kingdoms. We'll walk through the crypts where ancient kings sleep with iron swords across their laps, still guarding secrets that could shatter everything we think we know about the North. We'll witness the moment a king knelt to save his people, the night a family was butchered at a wedding feast, and the dawn when the dead themselves rose to claim the living. But here's something that will haunt you throughout this entire journey. Deep in the crypts of Winterfell, beneath layers of stone and bone, there lies a secret so profound that it connects the very first Stark to the last. A mystery that explains why there must always be a Stark in Winterfell, why the old gods whisper through the heart trees, and why the blood of the first men carries something that even the maesters of the Citadel cannot fully understand. Tonight you'll discover what the Night King truly sought in that ancient castle, and why 8,000 years of Stark rule was never just about governing the North. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. This is a story that begins with a man who could speak to giants and ends with a boy who became a king. It's about direwolves that bonded with children, about honor that survived even death itself, and about a family motto that proved prophetic in ways no one could have imagined. Winter came again and again, but the wolves endured. From Bran the Builder's legendary construction of the wall to protect all of humanity through the kings of winter who ruled the north for thousands of years, to Torrhen Stark who knelt to dragons to save his people. From Ned Stark's noble sacrifice that ignited a war, through Robb's brilliant victories and tragic defeat, to the scattered wolf pups who grew into legends themselves. You'll witness Arya Stark become death incarnate, trained by the faceless men of Braavos. Sansa Stark transform from naive girl to political mastermind. Bran Stark evolved from a climbing boy to the mystical three-eyed raven who could see across all of time itself. And Jon Snow, the bastard who knew nothing, discover he was born to be a king but chose to remain true to his heart. But that secret in the crypts calls to us now. The ancient magic that flows through Stark blood, connecting them to forces older than the 7 kingdoms, older than the faith, older than written history itself. The reason why Brandon Stark could walk into ravens and wolves, why Jon Snow came back from the dead, why the Night King himself marched south, seeking something that only the Starks possessed. Tonight we unravel 8 millennia of mysteries, the rise and fall and rise again of the wolves of Winterfell, their triumphs that echo through the ages, their tragedies that still make grown men weep, and their ultimate destiny that none of them could have foreseen. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the snows of the north, where winter is always coming, and the Starks have been waiting for it all along. 8,000 years before Aegon the Conqueror set foot on Westeros, in an age when giants walked the earth and the children of the forest sang to the trees, a man emerged from the mists of legend who would change the very shape of the world. His name was Brandon Stark, though history would remember him as Bran the Builder, and his achievements stretch far beyond anything mortal men should be capable of accomplishing. The Age of Heroes was ending, but not quietly. The long war between the first men and the children of the forest had raged for generations, turning the green lands red with blood and the ancient forests into battlegrounds where magic clashed with iron. The first men had crossed the narrow sea with bronze weapons and burning hearts, cutting down the sacred weirwoods and driving the children from their ancient groves. But the children fought back with powers the invaders could barely comprehend, commanding the very elements themselves and calling upon creatures of shadow and ice. Into this world of constant warfare and supernatural terror came Bran Stark, descended from the first men but touched by something far older. The legends say he could speak the old tongue so perfectly that even the giants understood his words, that he could see through the eyes of ravens and wolves, and that the weirwood trees themselves whispered their ancient secrets to him in dreams. His first great work would become the foundation of his family's power for all the ages to come. On a hill overlooking the Wolfswood, where hot springs bubbled up from deep within the earth, Bran the Builder began construction of a castle unlike anything the world had ever seen. Winterfell rose stone by stone, its towers reaching toward the gray northern sky, its walls thick enough to withstand siege engines that hadn't even been invented yet. But the true marvel lay beneath. The crypts of Winterfell stretched down into the earth level after level, carved from living rock with chambers vast enough to hold the tombs of kings. Ancient magic was woven into every stone, protective spells that would endure long after their creator had returned to dust. The iron swords placed across the laps of the buried kings weren't just ceremonial, they served as wards against things that might otherwise rise in the dark places beneath the earth. Yet Winterfell was only the beginning of Bran the Builder's legendary works. As the war between the first men and the children raged toward its climax, something far worse stirred in the uttermost north. The others, beings of ice and shadow older than human memory, began to move south. Where they walked, the very air froze solid. The dead rose to serve them, and darkness itself seemed to follow in their wake. The war between the living and the dead would become known as the Long Night, a winter that lasted a generation and nearly extinguished all life in Westeros. Heroes arose to fight the darkness, their names lost to time except for whispered fragments in the oldest songs. The last hero, they called one of them, who ventured into the heart of winter with only a sword, a horse, and a dog. Some maesters believe this last hero was Bran Stark himself, though the truth is buried in the ice of ages past. What is certain is that when dawn finally came, and the others retreated to whatever cold hell had spawned them, it was Bran the Builder who ensured they could never return. With the help of the giants, those ancient children of the earth who stood 3 times the height of men, and with the mystical assistance of the children of the forest, he began his greatest work. The wall rose across the narrow places where the north met the true wilderness beyond. 700 feet high, and stretching from the frost fangs to the shivering sea, it was more than just ice and stone. Ancient magic was woven into its very foundation, spells so powerful they would endure for 8,000 years. No creature of darkness could pass through it, no wight could climb over it, no other could breach it through sorcery. The wall was both prison and protection, keeping the ancient evils locked away in the frozen wasteland where they belonged. But someone had to guard it, to watch for signs that the darkness might stir again. Thus was born the Night's Watch, an order of sworn brothers who would take no wives, hold no lands, father no children, and serve until death. Their vows were sealed with words that would be repeated for millennia to come. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. But even as he raised the wall, Bran the Builder was forging the peace that would end the war between the first men and the children. The pact was signed on the Isle of Faces, witnessed by the old gods themselves. The first men would worship in the godswoods and keep the ancient ways, while the children would retreat to their hidden places and trouble the realms of men no more. From this union of old magic and new ambition, House Stark was truly born. Bran the Builder took the direwolf as his sigil, a creature fierce enough to hunt in the coldest winters, but loyal enough to die for its pack. The grey and white of their banner reflected the colors of the North itself, where snow and stone had shaped a hard people for a harsh land. As the first king of winter, Bran Stark established laws and customs that would endure for thousands of years. Guest right, the sacred protection offered to any who shared bread and salt under his roof. The tradition of keeping gods' woods in every castle, with heart trees where the old gods could still be worshipped. The belief that he who passes the sentence should swing the sword, that true justice requires the courage to look into the eyes of the condemned. Most importantly, he established the principle that would become the Stark motto and their sacred duty: winter is coming. It wasn't just a warning about the changing seasons. It was a reminder that darkness would always return, that vigilance was the price of survival, and that the North must always be ready to stand against whatever horrors might emerge from the frozen wastes beyond the wall. The blood of Bran the Builder flowed with the ancient magic of the first men, touched by the power of the old gods, and strengthened by the pact with the children. This blood would prove to carry gifts beyond normal human understanding. The ability to enter the minds of animals, to see through their eyes and command their actions. The power to glimpse the past and future through the weirwood trees. The connection to the very spirit of the North itself. When Bran the Builder finally died, after a reign longer than most dynasties, he was entombed in the deepest level of the crypts beneath Winterfell. An iron sword was laid across his lap, not just to honor his memory, but to guard against the possibility that even death might not contain the power that flowed through his veins. The kingdom he built would endure for 8,000 years, passing from father to son in an unbroken line longer than any other royal house in the known world. The wall he raised would stand sentinel against the dark until the very end of days, and the words he spoke would echo through every generation of his descendants, a promise and a warning that would prove prophetic in ways he could never have imagined. Winter was indeed coming again and again, and the Starks would always be ready. In the centuries following Bran the Builder's death, his descendants carved out an empire from the frozen wilderness that would dwarf the ambitions of later southern kings. The kingdom of winter stretched from the Gift in the south to the haunted forests beyond the last river in the north, from the western shores where the waves crashed against towering cliffs to the eastern mountains where the morning mist never fully lifted. These early Stark kings faced challenges that would have broken lesser dynasties. The North was not some gentle southern realm where knights rode through flowering meadows. It was a savage land of endless forests, treacherous bogs, and winters so harsh they could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Yet from this unforgiving wilderness the Starks forged something magnificent. The first great conquest came under Theon Stark, remembered in the histories as the Hungry Wolf. His was not a poetic nickname born from songs and stories. Theon earned it through sheer relentless warfare that left his enemies comparing him to a starving predator that would devour anything in its path. When the Andals came across the narrow sea with their iron weapons and their seven-pointed star, bringing fire and death to the kingdoms of the first men, most of the southern realms fell within a generation. But the North was different. The North had wolves. The Andal invasion reached the Neck sometime during the third millennium before Aegon's landing, and there they met something they had not encountered in their conquests further south. The crannogmen of the swamps fought like phantoms, appearing from the mists to sink Andal longships and vanishing before retaliation could come. But it was Theon Stark who delivered the killing blow to Andal ambitions in the north. The Battle of the Weeping Water became the graveyard of Andal hopes. 7 Andal kings had joined forces, certain that their superior iron weapons and cavalry tactics would sweep aside the bronze-armed northerners as they had everywhere else. They found instead a wolf pack led by a king who understood that survival meant adaptation, not pride. Theon had secretly acquired iron weapons of his own, trading with pirates and sellswords who cared nothing for the religious wars consuming Westeros. When the Andal host crossed the river at dawn, they expected to face barbarians with bronze spears. Instead, they met disciplined formations of ironclad infantry supported by archers whose arrows could punch through Andal mail at 200 paces. The slaughter was so complete that the river ran red for 3 days. The survivors who fled south carried tales that would keep future Andal adventurers away from the north for generations. Ned Stark had proven that the wolves could not be tamed, and more importantly, that they could learn from their enemies while never abandoning their own strength. But conquest was only the beginning of Stark dominion. The scattered tribes and petty kings of the north needed to be welded into something greater, and this required a different kind of warfare entirely. The Starks understood that ruling the north meant more than just defeating enemies. It meant earning the fierce loyalty of a proud people who would follow strength but never bow to weakness. The Red Kings of the Dreadfort had ruled the eastern regions for 1,000 years before the Starks came. House Bolton claimed descent from the First Men just as the Starks did, but where the Starks had learned honor and justice from their union with the old gods, the Boltons had embraced something far darker. Their sigil was a flayed man, and their reputation for cruelty was matched only by their effectiveness in battle. The war between the Starks and Boltons raged for 3 generations before Brandon Stark, great-grandson of the Hungry Wolf, finally cornered Royce Bolton at his own castle. The Dreadfort had never fallen to siege, but Brandon didn't need to take it by force. Instead, he offered single combat, king against king, winner take all. The fight lasted from dawn until dusk, 2 men wielding ancient swords while their armies watched in silence. When Brandon finally drove his blade through Royce Bolton's heart, he made a decision that would echo through the ages. Rather than destroy House Bolton entirely, he offered them a choice: kneel and keep their lands as his bannermen, or see their bloodline ended forever. Royce Bolton's son knelt, and the Starks gained not just the eastern territories, but also the most fearsome warriors in the north. It was a pattern they would repeat again and again. The Umbers of Last Hearth, giants of men who fought with 2-handed swords and voices that could be heard across a battlefield. The Karstarks, distant cousins who shared Stark blood but had carved out their own kingdom around Carthold. The Mormonts of Bear Island, whose women fought alongside their men and whose warriors feared nothing that walked on land or swam in the sea. Each conquest brought new strength to the growing kingdom of winter, but also new challenges. The Starks learned to govern not through fear, but through justice, offering fair treatment to those who bent the knee while showing terrible wrath to those who broke their word. Guest right became sacred law throughout the north. A man who offered bread and salt was bound by the old gods to protect his guests, and the penalty for violating that trust was death. Edwin Stark, known as the Spring King for the long peace that marked his reign, established the first great library at Winterfell. The maesters would later claim this showed southern influence, but they were wrong. Edwin understood something the southern lords had forgotten. Knowledge was power, and the North's isolation meant that hard-won wisdom could be lost forever if it wasn't written down. The library became a repository, not just for the genealogies and laws that every great house maintained, but for something far more precious. The ancient songs of the first men were transcribed by learned scribes. The secrets of survival in the harshest winters were recorded for future generations. Most importantly, the old agreements and treaties that bound the various northern houses were preserved in writing, creating a legal framework that would survive even when memories failed. Yet for all their achievements in war and governance, the early Stark kings never forgot their greatest responsibility. The walls still stood, and the Night's Watch still kept their vigil, but the ancient compact that Bran the Builder had forged required constant maintenance. Every year, Stark kings sent supplies north to Castle Black. Young men who chose the Black were given the Lord's blessing, along with weapons and horses. When wildling raiders crossed the wall, northern armies marched to support the Watch. This was more than feudal obligation. The Starks remembered what their ancestors had faced during the long night, and they understood that the true enemy had not been destroyed, merely defeated. The others still lurked in the uttermost north, waiting for their chance to bring eternal winter to the world of men. The wall was humanity's shield, and that shield required constant support from those who understood its true purpose. Jon Stark I, who ruled during the 4th millennium before the conquest, led the largest expedition beyond the wall since the days of the last hero. 3,000 northern warriors joined with the Night's Watch to pursue a wildling king who had been raiding the Gift with increasing boldness. The campaign lasted 2 years and penetrated deeper into the true north than any armed force had ventured since the Age of Heroes. What they found there was never fully recorded, but the survivors who returned spoke in whispers of ruined cities buried beneath glacial ice, of strange lights that danced in the aurora, and of sounds in the wind that seemed almost like voices calling from impossibly far away. Jon Stark ordered the expedition's findings sealed in the deepest vaults of Winterfell, with instructions that they should only be opened when winter came again in earnest. The Kingdom of Winter had grown strong, but its kings never forgot that strength alone would not be enough when the real test came. Deep in the archives of the Citadel, there exists a text so disturbing that only the most senior maesters are permitted to read it. The account speaks of a time when the Night's Watch itself became the enemy, when the very guardians of humanity turned against those they had sworn to protect. The tale centers on a man whose name has been deliberately erased from history, known now only by a title that still sends chills through the halls of Castle Black. They called him the Night's King. According to the fragmentary records that survive, he was once the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, a man who had taken the black and sworn the sacred oaths that bound him to a life of service. But somewhere in his tenure, something went catastrophically wrong. The accounts vary in their details, but all agree on the central horror of what transpired. While ranging beyond the wall, this nameless commander encountered a woman unlike any he had ever seen. Her skin was pale as fresh snow, her eyes blue as winter ice, and when she looked upon him, his very soul seemed to freeze within his chest. She was beautiful in the way that a blizzard is beautiful, terrible and magnificent, and utterly deadly. Most chilling of all, she may not have been entirely human. The commander brought her back to the Night Fort, that grim fortress that was then the Night's Watch's primary stronghold. What happened next violated every law of gods and men. He took her as his bride, despite his vows of celibacy. Worse still, he declared himself not just Lord Commander but King, ruling over the Night's Watch as his personal domain. For 13 years, his reign of terror continued. The accounts speak of dark rituals performed in the depths of the Night Fort, of screams that echoed through the tunnels beneath the castle, of brothers who entered the Lord Commander's chambers and were never seen again. Some whispered that the Night's King was making sacrifices to the others, offering the lives of his own men to purchase power and knowledge from the ancient enemy. Others claimed he had discovered ways to preserve life beyond its natural span, explaining how he could rule for 13 years while growing ever more terrible rather than aging. What is certain is that his reign finally ended through the combined efforts of two bitter enemies who put aside their differences to face a threat greater than their mutual hatred. Bran the Breaker, King of Winter, joined forces with Joramun, the king beyond the wall, to march on the Night Fort. The battle that followed was less a military engagement than an exorcism, a cleansing of corruption that had festered too long in the sacred halls of the Night's Watch. When the Night's King finally fell, his body was burned rather than entombed, and his name was struck from every record the victors could find. The Night Fort itself was eventually abandoned, though whether this was due to practical considerations or because the castle had been too thoroughly tainted by what had transpired, there remains a matter of speculation among the maesters. Yet the most disturbing aspect of the Night's King legend is not what the histories record, but what they carefully avoid mentioning. Several accounts hint that he may have been a Stark himself, a younger son of the King of Winter, who chose the Black to serve the realm, but instead nearly destroyed it. The implications of this possibility haunted the Stark kings for generations afterward. Bran the Breaker understood that the Night King's corruption represented more than just personal failure. It revealed a fundamental weakness in the defenses that his ancestor Bran the Builder had constructed. The wall could keep the others out, but it could not prevent corruption from taking root within. The Night's Watch could stand guard against external threats. But what happened when the guards themselves became the enemy? The solution Brandon implemented would shape Stark policy toward the wall for thousands of years to come. Rather than simply sending supplies and recruits to the Night's Watch, the Kings of Winter began maintaining direct oversight of the Order's activities. Stark representatives would visit Castle Black regularly, ostensibly to ensure that the Watch had everything it needed, but actually to watch for signs that history might repeat itself. More importantly, Brandon established a network of communication that extended far beyond the wall. The wildlings who lived in the true north were no longer seen simply as enemies to be fought, but as an early warning system against threats emerging from even deeper in the frozen wilderness. Relationships were carefully cultivated with certain wildling leaders, men and women who understood that some enemies were too dangerous to face alone. This policy paid dividends during the reign of Roderick Stark, who faced what became known as the Cold Summer. For 3 years, the seasons seemed to reverse themselves. Summer snows fell south of the wall, while the lands beyond grew so cold that even the hardiest wildlings began fleeing south. The Night's Watch reported strange lights in the northern sky, and sounds like the cracking of enormous sheets of ice, though no ice formations large enough to produce such noise could be found. Most disturbing were the reports from the Shadow Tower, the westernmost of the Night's Watch castles. Rangers reported finding wildling villages that had been abandoned so suddenly that fires were still burning in the hearths, but every living thing had vanished. Not killed, not taken captive, simply gone as if they had walked into the wind and dissolved. Roderick Stark made a decision that would have been unthinkable to southern lords, but which demonstrated the unique wisdom of northern leadership. He opened the gates of Winterfell to wildling refugees, offering them sanctuary south of the wall, in exchange for everything they could tell him about what was happening in the deeper north. The information he gathered was compiled into what became known as the Cold Codex, a record of supernatural threats that would guide Stark policy for centuries. The wildlings spoke of villages found empty, except for spirals carved into every wooden surface, the same symbol repeated endlessly in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. They described finding horses frozen solid while still standing, as if winter had claimed them in a single instant. Most chilling were the accounts of sounds in the night, voices calling in languages that predated human speech, seeming to come from the sky itself. The cold summer eventually ended, but not before claiming thousands of lives and teaching the Starks a crucial lesson. The others were not simply an ancient threat that had been defeated and contained. They were a continuing presence in the world, active and aware and patient beyond human comprehension. The wall had not destroyed them, but merely forced them to find subtler ways to extend their influence. This realization led to the establishment of what the maesters would later call the Winter Archives, a collection of documents housed in the deepest levels of Winterfell's library. Every strange report from beyond the wall, every account of supernatural occurrences in the north, every scrap of information about the others and their capabilities was carefully recorded and preserved. The Stark kings understood that knowledge would be humanity's greatest weapon when the long night came again. Because it would come again. The ancient enemy was patient, but not inactive. They were watching, learning, preparing for their next attempt to bring eternal darkness to the world of men. And when that time came, the kings of winter wanted their descendants to be ready. The raven arrived at Winterfell on a grey morning in late autumn, its black wings cutting through the falling snow like an omen of the changes to come. The message it carried would force Torrhen Stark to make a decision that would echo through every generation of his bloodline for the next 3 centuries. In the south, 3 dragons had landed on Westerosi soil, and with them came a conqueror whose ambitions would reshape the known world. Aegon Targaryen was no ordinary warlord seeking to carve out a petty kingdom for himself. The reports filtering north spoke of something unprecedented in the history of warfare. Harrenhal, the mightiest fortress ever built, had been reduced to melted stone in a single afternoon. The combined armies of the Reach and the Rock, the largest military force assembled in living memory, had been scattered to the winds at the Field of Fire. Ancient bloodlines that had ruled for thousands of years were choosing between bending the knee or facing complete annihilation. For Torrhen Stark, the last king of winter, these reports presented an impossible dilemma. The North had never been conquered, not by the Andals with their iron weapons and religious fervor, not by the various southern kings who had occasionally tried to extend their domains northward, not even by the others during the long night, though they had come closer than any mortal enemy ever would. The very identity of the North was built on its independence, its refusal to bow to any authority save the old gods and the ancient ways. Yet Torrhen was no fool blinded by pride and tradition. He had not survived the brutal politics of northern lordship by making decisions based on emotion rather than calculation. The man who had earned the respect of every major house from the wall to the neck understood that sometimes wisdom required swallowing one's pride to preserve something more important than personal honor. The discussions in Winterfell's great hall stretched through the long nights of approaching winter. The lords of the great houses had gathered at their king's summons, and each brought their own perspective on the crisis facing the realm. Some, like Roderick Ricewell and Torrhen Manderly, urged immediate action. 30,000 northern swords could be in the field within a fortnight, they argued. The dragons were formidable, but they were only 3 beasts against the combined might of the unconquered north. Others counseled caution. Lord Harwood Umber, whose family had fought wildlings and worse for generations, pointed out that the North's strength had always come from fighting on familiar ground. Beyond the neck lay territory that northern armies had never campaigned in, supplied by lines of communication that could be easily severed. Even if they could match Aegon's forces in open battle, what would be left of the North after such a war? Brandon Snow, Torrhen's bastard brother and closest advisor, offered perhaps the most troubling perspective of all. He had spent years traveling through the southern kingdoms as an envoy and observer, and he understood better than most what they were truly facing. This was not simply a war between competing claims to thrones. Aegon Targaryen represented something entirely new in Westerosi politics, a single ruler backed by power that could not be matched by conventional forces, offering a choice between cooperation and extinction. The debate continued for days, but Torrhen had already made his decision. He would march south with the full strength of the North, but not to wage war. Instead, he would demonstrate northern power one final time before choosing to preserve it rather than see it destroyed in a futile gesture of defiance. The army that assembled outside Winterfell was unlike anything that had marched from the north in living memory. 30,000 men answered the call, from the greybeards of Last Hearth to the young knights of White Harbor. The sight of so many banners flying together should have filled every northern heart with pride. But there was an undertone of melancholy to the gathering. Many of the lords suspected what their king intended, even if they could not bring themselves to speak it aloud. The march south took on an almost ceremonial quality. This was the last time the banners of an independent kingdom of winter would fly in formation, the final campaign of kings who had ruled the north since time immemorial. Veterans who had fought wildlings beyond the wall marched alongside young men who had never seen battle, all of them understanding that they were participating in the end of an age. When they reached the Trident, Aegon's army was waiting for them on the opposite bank. The sight should have been cause for confidence. The northern host outnumbered the Targaryen forces by nearly 2-1, and northern steel had never known defeat in open battle. But circling high above the enemy camp were three shapes that changed every calculation of military strategy. Valerian the Black Dread was larger than a warship, his wings casting shadows that could cover entire battalions. Viger and Meraxes were smaller but no less terrible, and all three carried riders who had already proven they would not hesitate to use their power. The meeting between the two kings took place on a small island in the middle of the river, a neutral ground where Torrhen Stark came face to face with the man who would end his family's ancient sovereignty. Aegon Targaryen was younger than expected, but there was something in his purple eyes that spoke of absolute certainty. He was not a conqueror drunk on victory, but a man who genuinely believed he was forging something greater than the petty kingdoms he was destroying. Their conversation was brief and surprisingly cordial. Aegon offered generous terms. The North could keep its laws, its customs, its way of life. The Starks would rule as they always had, answering to the Iron Throne in matters of war and major policy, but otherwise governing as they saw fit. The alternative was fire and blood, the complete destruction of a bloodline that had endured since the dawn of human civilization in Westeros. Torrhen Stark made his choice with the full knowledge of what it meant. When he knelt on that muddy island and acknowledged Aegon Targaryen as his king, he was not just surrendering his own crown, but ending 8,000 years of northern independence. The lords who had followed him south watched in stunned silence as their king became a subject, as the Kingdom of Winter became just another region in a larger realm. Yet history would prove that Torrhen's decision was perhaps the wisest ever made by a Stark king. The North survived intact where other kingdoms were broken and reshaped. The ancient ways persisted where the faith of the Seven made inroads elsewhere. The Stark bloodline continued unbroken where other royal houses found themselves replaced by Targaryen appointees. Most importantly, the choice preserved northern strength for the challenges that lay ahead. The wall still needed defending, and the Night's Watch still required support from the South's new rulers. By bending the knee, Torrhen ensured that when the real winter came, when the ancient enemy stirred again in the uttermost north, the wolves would still be there to meet them. The king who knelt had saved his people by surrendering his pride, and in doing so had proven that true strength sometimes requires the courage to appear weak. More than a century had passed since Torrhen Stark knelt beside the trident, and the North had settled into an uneasy but prosperous peace under Targaryen rule. The great castles still flew their ancient banners. The old gods still received their worship in godswoods throughout the realm, and Stark kings had become Stark lords without losing much of their practical authority. Then came the ravens bearing news that would drag the North into the most destructive civil war in Westerosi history. King Viserys Targaryen was dead, and with his passing, the realm faced a succession crisis that would tear the Seven Kingdoms apart. His chosen heir, Princess Rhaenyra, found her claim challenged by her younger half-brother Aegon, backed by their mother Queen Alicent and the powerful hand of the king, Otto Hightower. Both sides possessed dragons, both commanded the loyalty of great houses, and both were prepared to burn the realm to ash rather than yield to their rival. At Winterfell, Lord Cragan Stark faced a decision that would define his legacy and the North's role in the coming catastrophe. He was a man shaped by the harsh realities of northern politics, where weakness meant death and hesitation could doom entire bloodlines. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with the gray eyes and long brown hair that marked him as unmistakably Stark, Cragan commanded respect through presence alone before he ever spoke a word. The choice before him seemed simple enough on the surface. Princess Rhaenyra had been King Viserys' acknowledged heir for decades, confirmed by oaths sworn by every major lord in the realm. By the laws of succession and the bonds of honor that the North held sacred, her claim was legitimate. Yet politics is never as straightforward as law, and Cregan understood that choosing sides in this conflict would have consequences far beyond determining who sat the Iron Throne. The decision was made when Prince Cacaris Velaryon arrived at Winterfell's gates, riding the dragon Vermax through northern skies that had never before seen such creatures. The young prince carried with him not just his mother's plea for support, but an offer that would bind the Stark and Targaryen bloodlines together in ways that echoed back to the ancient pacts that had shaped the North. The Pact of Ice and Fire, as the maesters would later call it, was more than just a military alliance. Garceris proposed marriage between his future children and Cregan's, uniting dragon and wolf in bonds that would strengthen both bloodlines. For the North, it offered something unprecedented since the conquest, a voice in the highest councils of the realm, a guarantee that northern interests would never again be forgotten by southern kings. Cregan's acceptance of the pact sent ripples throughout the North. The great houses that had followed Stark banners for thousands of years now found themselves committed to a war that many of them barely understood. Yet when their lord called, they answered. The northern host that began assembling at Winterfell would eventually grow to unprecedented size, drawing warriors from every corner of the realm from the wall to the neck. What made this army unique was not just its size but its composition. These were not the young knights and eager squires who typically filled the ranks of southern armies. The Dance of Dragons had already raged for nearly 2 years by the time the northern host began its march, and news of the carnage had reached every village and holdfast in the Seven Kingdoms. The men who joined Cregan's banner were predominantly older warriors, greybeards who understood the cost of war and were willing to pay it. They called themselves the Winter Wolves, and their reputation for ferocity would become legendary throughout the realm. These were veterans of countless battles against wildlings, men who had faced the harsh realities of northern warfare, where mercy was a luxury and survival demanded absolute commitment. They marched south, not for glory or plunder, but because they understood that honor sometimes required sacrifice. The journey south took months, hampered by the need to coordinate with allied forces and gather supplies for such a massive undertaking. Reports from the battlefields they were marching toward grew increasingly grim. Dragons were dying, entire bloodlines were being extinguished, and great cities were burning. The Targaryens were destroying themselves with a thoroughness that even their enemies had never managed. By the time Cregan's host reached the Riverlands, the war had effectively ended. King Aegon II was dead, poisoned by persons unknown. Prince Aemond One-Eye had perished at the Battle of the God's Eye, locked in mortal combat with his uncle Daemon above the dark waters of Harrenhal. Most of the dragons were dead, and those that survived were too young or too traumatized to be effective weapons of war. Yet rather than turn around and march home, Cregan made a decision that would establish his reputation as one of the most formidable political minds of his generation. The realm was in chaos, with no clear authority and various factions maneuvering for advantage in the power vacuum. Someone needed to restore order, and the Lord of Winterfell was uniquely positioned to do so. What followed became known as the Hour of the Wolf, though it lasted far longer than a single hour. Cregan Stark arrived in King's Landing with an army 20,000 strong, giving him military superiority over any potential rivals. But rather than seize power for himself, he accepted appointment as Hand of the King to the young Aegon III, Rhaenyra's surviving son. His first act was to call for the heads of those responsible for the worst atrocities of the war. Lord Larys Strong, the spy master, whose machinations had helped prolong the conflict, found himself facing northern justice. Sir Perkin the Flea and other low-born commanders, who had committed outrages during the storming of King's Landing, learned that the wolves did not distinguish between high and low when it came to punishment for war crimes. The execution sent a clear message throughout the realm. The war was over, and there would be accountability for those who had prolonged the suffering through their ambitions. Cregan's justice was harsh but impartial, falling on green and black supporters alike when evidence of wrongdoing was presented. The Night's Watch received dozens of new recruits as men chose the wall over the headsman's axe. Yet perhaps Cregan's most important contribution to the restoration of peace was his understanding of when to step aside. After less than a year serving as Hand, he resigned his position and prepared to return north. The realm was stable, the new king was secure on his throne, and the Stark Lord had no desire to become entangled in the permanent intrigues of the capital. His departure marked the end of direct northern involvement in southern politics for generations to come. The Winter Wolves who survived the war were granted lands and honors, but most chose to return home rather than seek their fortunes at court. They had seen enough of southern politics to last several lifetimes, and the familiar coldness of the north seemed like paradise after the heated conspiracies of King's Landing. The marriage pact that had brought the North into the war was quietly set aside, another casualty of the devastating conflict that had killed so many. Yet the precedent had been established. When the realm faced its greatest crisis, it was northern steel and northern honor that had restored order. The Starks had proven that they could play the Game of Thrones when necessary, but they preferred the straightforward challenges of ruling their own domain. Cregan returned to Winterfell as one of the most respected lords in the Seven Kingdoms, a man who had wielded more real power than many kings, but had chosen duty over ambition. His legacy would influence Stark policy for centuries to come, establishing the principle that the North would honor its obligations to the Iron Throne, but would never again allow itself to become entangled in the deadly games that Southern lords played with such enthusiasm. The reign of Daron II brought unprecedented prosperity to the Seven Kingdoms, but it also sowed the seeds of a conflict that would plague the realm for generations. The king's decision to legitimize his bastard half-siblings, including the charismatic Deberman Blackfyre, created rival claimants to the Iron Throne who possessed both royal blood and the military prowess to make their ambitions reality. For the North, these rebellions would test the loyalty that the Starks had sworn to the Targaryen dynasty, while forcing them to navigate increasingly complex political waters. Lord Stark's response to the First Blackfyre Rebellion revealed the fundamental pragmatism that had guided Northern policy since the conquest. When Daemon Blackfyre declared himself the rightful king and began gathering supporters throughout the realm, many great houses found themselves torn between competing loyalties and uncertain which claimant would ultimately prevail. The Starks faced no such dilemma. They had sworn fealty to the Iron Throne, and Daron II occupied that throne by right of succession. The northern contribution to the loyalist cause was substantial but carefully calculated. Rather than commit the full strength of the North to what might prove to be a protracted campaign, Lord Stark sent a force large enough to demonstrate northern commitment, but not so large as to leave the realm defensively vulnerable. The harsh lessons learned during the Dance of Dragons had taught the Starks that southern wars had a tendency to consume far more resources than anyone initially expected. The Battle of Redgrass Field became the crucible where the fate of the Seven Kingdoms was decided. The northern contingent fought with the methodical efficiency that had become their trademark, forming the solid center of the loyalist battle line, while more flamboyant forces maneuvered on the flanks. When Prince Basila Breakspear led the charge that finally broke Daemon's forces, northern spears were there to exploit the breakthrough and prevent any organized retreat. Yet victory came at a terrible cost that extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The realm had been divided against itself in ways that would not heal quickly, and the Blackfyre cause, though defeated, was not destroyed. Daemon's surviving sons fled across the narrow sea, where they began planning their eventual return with the backing of foreign powers who saw opportunity in Westerosi instability. The Second Blackfyre Rebellion, led by Daemon's son Daemon II, presented the North with challenges that could not be solved through military action alone. This uprising was more subtle than its predecessor, relying on conspiracy and assassination rather than open warfare. When reports reached Winterfell of strange deaths among loyalist nobles and mysterious fires consuming important documents, Lord Stark understood that the realm was facing a different kind of threat entirely. The northern response was characteristically direct, rather than attempt to match the conspirators' subtlety. Lord Stark increased security around all northern castles, and established a network of reliable messengers who could carry information without risk of interception. The old ways of conducting business, with face-to-face meetings and verbal agreements witnessed by multiple parties, suddenly became relevant again as written communications proved vulnerable to enemy action. More importantly, the Starks began cultivating relationships with the Night's Watch that went beyond their traditional support for the Order. The Wall had always been a place where men could disappear from the political calculations of the Seven Kingdoms, but during the Blackfire years it became something more valuable. A reliable source of information about movements in the Eastern Kingdoms, where Blackfire supporters were known to maintain contacts with potential allies. The Third Rebellion brought the conflict closer to northern borders than ever before. Aegon Blackfire's invasion force landed at various points along the eastern coast, and for several terrifying weeks it appeared that the north might face direct attack. The response from Winterfell was swift and overwhelming. Every able-bodied man between 16 and 60 was called to arms, and the ancient beacon system that had warned of wildling raids was activated to coordinate the defense. Yet the invasion never materialized in the north. Aegon's forces were defeated further south, and the immediate threat passed without northern warriors needing to draw their swords. The experience was nonetheless transformative for the Stark leadership. They had been reminded that their isolation was not absolute, that the conflicts consuming the southern kingdoms could reach even the most remote corners of their domain. The Great Spring Sickness that followed the Third Rebellion tested northern resilience in ways that warfare never could. The plague that swept through the Seven Kingdoms showed no respect for borders or banners, striking down lords and peasants alike with impartial cruelty. In the north, where communities were often isolated by vast distances and harsh terrain, the disease spread more slowly but with devastating effect when it finally arrived. Lord Stark's response to the crisis demonstrated the administrative competence that had kept the North stable through generations of turmoil. Rather than wait for the sickness to run its course, he implemented a systematic quarantine program that limited travel between communities and established supply lines to ensure that isolated settlements would not starve while cut off from normal trade routes. The measures were harsh but effective, saving thousands of lives at the cost of economic disruption that took years to fully resolve. The recovery period following the Great Spring Sickness saw significant changes in northern society. The massive loss of life had created opportunities for social mobility that had not existed for generations. Younger sons who had never expected to inherit found themselves lords of ancient houses, while commoners, whose skills were suddenly in high demand, could rise to positions of genuine authority. These social changes coincided with broader transformations throughout the Seven Kingdoms, as King Aegon V, known to history as Aegon the Unlikely, began implementing reforms designed to improve conditions for the common people. The North had always maintained a more egalitarian relationship between nobles and commoners than existed in the southern kingdoms, but even there the new royal policies had significant impact. The Stark lords of this period found themselves walking a careful line between supporting royal initiatives they genuinely believed in and maintaining the traditional northern independence that their bannermen expected. The solution was characteristically pragmatic. Royal decrees were implemented in the north, but they were adapted to local conditions and customs in ways that preserved the essential character of northern society while satisfying the technical requirements of royal law. The final Blackfire Rebellion, led by Maelys the Monstrous during the reign of Jaehaerys II, found the north more prepared than ever before. Decades of dealing with conspiracy and instability had taught the Starks valuable lessons about intelligence gathering and rapid response to emerging threats. When word came that the Golden Company had landed in the Stepstones, northern ravens were already flying to every major castle with detailed instructions for coordinating the loyalist response. The War of the Ninepenny Kings, as the final rebellion came to be known, saw northern forces serving with distinction under the command of the young Prince Duncan Targaryen. The northern contingent was smaller than in previous conflicts, but it was also more professional, composed largely of experienced soldiers who understood both their tactical role and the broader political implications of the campaign they were fighting. Victory at the Stepstones finally ended the Blackfyre threat, but it also marked the end of an era for the Seven Kingdoms. The long period of intermittent rebellion had transformed the realm in fundamental ways, creating new institutions and new relationships between the Iron Throne and its vassals. The North had weathered these changes better than most regions, but even Winterfell could not remain completely unchanged by the tumultuous decades that had tested the very foundations of Targaryen rule. The tournament at Harrenhal should have been a celebration of chivalry and noble competition, a gathering of the greatest knights in the Seven Kingdoms to display their prowess before admiring crowds. Instead, it became the opening act of a tragedy that would consume House Stark and ultimately topple the Targaryen dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. The events that unfolded there would transform a generation of young nobles into the architects of revolution, and none would pay a higher price than the wolves of Winterfell. Brandon Stark arrived at Harrenhal as the embodiment of northern nobility, a young man whose very presence commanded attention and respect. Tall and powerful like his father before him, he possessed the natural charisma that marked him as a future leader of men. His betrothal to Catelyn Tully was more than just a political alliance. It represented the promise of a new generation that would guide the North through whatever challenges lay ahead. Yet beneath his confident exterior lay the fierce protective instincts that defined his bloodline, a quality that would prove both his greatest strength and his ultimate doom. The tournament itself unfolded with all the pageantry expected of such occasions, knights displaying their skills while noble ladies watched from elaborately decorated pavilions. Yet there were undercurrents of tension that the more observant participants could not ignore. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, heir to the Iron Throne and considered by many the finest knight of his generation, competed with a distracted air that suggested his mind was occupied with matters far removed from martial competition. When Rhaegar crowned Lyanna Stark as his Queen of Love and Beauty instead of his own wife, the gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. Lyanna, Brandon's beloved younger sister, was already betrothed to Robert Baratheon, and the crown of winter roses placed upon her head represented a breach of protocol so severe that it could not be dismissed as mere tournament tradition. The implications were clear to everyone present, even if none dared speak them aloud. The months that followed saw whispers and rumors spreading throughout the Seven Kingdoms like wildfire. Some claimed that Lyanna had been abducted by the prince, taken against her will to satisfy his obsession with ancient prophecies and mystical bloodlines. Others suggested a darker truth, that the Stark girl had gone willingly, abandoning her duty to her family and her betrothed for the sake of forbidden love. The truth would remain hidden for decades, but the consequences began immediately. Brandon's response to his sister's disappearance was exactly what anyone who knew him would have predicted. He rode straight to King's Landing with a small group of companions, his anger burning so hot that he could not be deterred by considerations of diplomacy or political consequences. The man who should have been the next Lord of Winterfell instead became the author of his family's destruction through a single moment of righteous fury. Standing before the Red Keep, Brandon Stark shouted words that would echo through history and seal his fate. "Come out and die, Rhaegar," he called, his voice carrying across the courtyard, where servants and nobles alike stopped to stare at this unprecedented breach of royal protocol. It was a challenge that demonstrated both his courage and his fatal inability to recognize that some battles cannot be won through strength alone. King Aerys Targaryen, already sliding into the madness that would earn him his infamous epithet, saw Brandon's challenge not as the desperate action of a brother fearing for his sister's safety, but as evidence of a broader conspiracy against the Iron Throne. The young Stark Lord and his companions were seized immediately, charged with treason, and thrown into the black cells beneath the Red Keep to await the king's justice. The raven that summoned Rickard Stark to King's Landing carried with it the doom of House Stark, though the Lord of Winterfell could not have known the full extent of the trap that awaited him. Rickard was a man shaped by decades of responsible leadership, someone who had navigated the complex politics of the North with wisdom and restraint. The idea that his eldest son's rash words could lead to anything more than diplomatic embarrassment seemed impossible to contemplate. Yet, Aerys Targaryen was no longer the king who had once been considered a promising young ruler. Years of paranoia and delusions had transformed him into something monstrous, a man who saw enemies in every shadow and treachery in every innocent gesture. When Rickard Stark arrived at the capital to answer for his son's supposed crimes, he found himself facing not a trial in any recognizable sense, but a mad king's twisted idea of justice. The trial by combat that Aerys decreed was a mockery of every principle of law and honor that the Seven Kingdoms had ever recognized. Rickard Stark was suspended from the rafters of the throne room in his full armor, while a fire was lit beneath him, slowly cooking him alive in the steel that should have protected him. His champion in this grotesque ordeal was not a knight but the flames themselves, and his only chance of survival lay in his son Brandon's ability to reach him. Brandon was brought into the throne room with a rope around his neck, positioned just close enough to his father that he might have been able to save him if he could somehow break free of his bonds. But every desperate lunge toward Rickard only tightened the noose, and the Mad King watched with obvious pleasure as the young Stark slowly strangled himself in a futile attempt to rescue the father who was burning alive mere feet away. The deaths of Rickard and Brandon Stark represented more than just the elimination of two individuals. They marked the destruction of a bloodline that had endured for 8,000 years. The surviving members of House Stark were scattered across the Seven Kingdoms, unprepared for the catastrophe that had befallen their family and uncertain how to respond to a threat they had never imagined possible. Ned Stark, studying at the Eyrie under Jon Arryn's guidance, learned of his father and brother's deaths through a message that transformed him from second son to Lord of Winterfell in a single devastating moment. The quiet, thoughtful young man, who had never expected to inherit anything more significant than a minor lordship, suddenly found himself responsible for the North's response to an unprecedented crisis. The alliance that formed in response to the Mad King's atrocity brought together houses that might otherwise have remained neutral in any conflict between the Iron Throne and its vassals. Jon Arryn's decision to call his banners rather than surrender his wards to Aerys's madness was the spark that ignited Robert's rebellion, but it was the Stark tragedy that provided the moral foundation for everything that followed. Robert Baratheon's love for Lyanna gave him personal motivation for the war, but Ned Stark's quest for justice transformed a romantic obsession into a righteous cause that could attract supporters throughout the realm. The sight of the wolves of Winterfell marching to war alongside the eagles of the Eyrie and the stag of Storm's End sent a clear message to every lord in the Seven Kingdoms. This was not a rebellion born of ambition, but a war of necessity against a king who had violated every principle of just rule. The campaigns that followed tested the new Lord of Winterfell in ways that his comfortable childhood had never prepared him for. Leading men in battle required different skills than the scholarly pursuits he had favored at the Eyrie, and the weight of command sat heavily on shoulders that had never expected to bear such responsibility. Yet Ned proved himself capable of rising to meet the challenges that fate had thrust upon him, earning the respect of hardened veterans through his willingness to share their dangers and his refusal to ask any man to face risks he would not face himself. The Tower of Joy would become the final chapter in the Stark family's personal tragedy, though the full truth of what transpired there would remain hidden for decades. When Ned Stark finally found his sister in that remote Dornish tower, he discovered secrets that would haunt him for the rest of his life and force him to make choices that contradicted every principle he held dear. The promise he made to Lyanna as she died would shape the remainder of his story, creating obligations that honor demanded he fulfill regardless of the personal cost. The war that began with Brandon Stark's furious challenge ended with the Targaryen dynasty in ruins and a new king on the Iron Throne. But victory could not restore what House Stark had lost. 3 members of the family had died during the conflict, and the survivors carried wounds that would never fully heal. The North had been forever changed by the rebellion, its ancient certainties shattered by the realization that even the most honorable families could be destroyed by forces beyond their control. The man who returned to Winterfell after Robert's rebellion was vastly different from the second son who had left years earlier to foster at the Eyrie. Ned Stark carried with him not just the scars of war, but the weight of secrets that would shape every decision he made for the remainder of his life. At barely 20, he had become Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and Keeper of Truths so dangerous that speaking them could destroy kingdoms. The first years of his rule were consumed with the monumental task of rebuilding what war had torn apart. The North had bled heavily during the rebellion, losing not just the flower of its nobility, but countless common soldiers whose absence left gaps in every community from the wall to the neck. Farms lay untended, trade routes had been disrupted, and the careful balance of power that had maintained northern stability for generations required delicate reconstruction. Ned's approach to these challenges revealed the fundamental decency that would define his lordship. Rather than simply demanding that his bannermen provide resources for reconstruction, he led by example, opening Winterfell's granaries to feed refugees and using the castle's craftsmen to help rebuild damaged infrastructure throughout his domain. The sight of the Lord of Winterfell personally overseeing relief efforts sent a powerful message to every northern house about the kind of leadership they could expect from the new generation. Marriage to Catelyn Tully represented both political necessity and personal sacrifice for a man still mourning his lost siblings. The union had been arranged originally for Brandon, and taking his dead brother's bride felt like another reminder of the family members who would never return to Winterfell's halls. Yet from duty came something deeper, and the years that followed saw genuine affection grow between 2 people who had been thrown together by tragedy. The children that followed brought new purpose to Ned's life, but they also created fresh anxieties for a man haunted by the knowledge of what political ambition could cost a family. Each son and daughter represented both hope for the future and potential vulnerability that enemies might exploit. The bastard boy he brought home from the war, claiming him as his own despite Catelyn's obvious displeasure, added another layer of complexity to household dynamics that would influence family relationships for years to come. Jon Snow's presence at Winterfell was a constant reminder of the promise Ned had made to his dying sister, a vow that honor demanded he keep regardless of personal cost. The boy's true parentage was perhaps the most dangerous secret in the Seven Kingdoms, information that could destabilize the new royal dynasty if it ever became public knowledge. Yet raising him as an acknowledged bastard while keeping the truth hidden required a delicate balance that tested even Ned's considerable reserves of patience and wisdom. The Greyjoy Rebellion of 289 provided the first major test of Ned's leadership in matters of war and diplomacy. Balon Greyjoy's decision to crown himself and declare the Iron Islands independent was both an insult to royal authority and a threat to northern security. Given the proximity of the islands to the western coast, The response required careful coordination with the Iron Throne while ensuring that northern interests remained protected. Leading northern forces to the Siege of Pike, alongside King Robert, revealed how much the Quiet Lord had learned about command since the desperate campaigns of the rebellion. The methodical approach he brought to reducing Balon's stronghold demonstrated both tactical competence and the strategic patience that had become his trademark. When the walls finally fell and the Greyjoy forces surrendered, Ned's decision to take Theon Greyjoy as a ward rather than simply executing the boy showed the complex blend of mercy and pragmatism that characterized his rule. The years of peace that followed allowed Ned to focus on the internal development that would become his greatest legacy as Lord of Winterfell. The justice tours that took him throughout the North each year were more than ceremonial obligations. They represented a genuine commitment to ensuring that even the humblest small folk could seek redress for their grievances. The sight of the Lord of Winterfell personally hearing disputes and rendering judgment reinforced the ancient Stark principle that leadership meant service rather than privilege. These journeys also served a deeper purpose, maintaining the personal connections that bound the great houses to Winterfell, despite the vast distances involved in governing a realm the size of the other 6 kingdoms combined. A lord who took the time to visit his bannermen's castles, who remembered the names of their children and the details of their local challenges, commanded loyalty that went far beyond feudal obligation. The relationships Ned cultivated during these progresses would prove invaluable when crisis eventually came to the 7 kingdoms. The establishment of formal trade relationships with the free cities across the narrow sea marked a significant departure from traditional northern isolation, but it also reflected Ned's understanding that his realm's long-term prosperity required adaptation to changing circumstances. The White Harbor merchants who carried northern goods to Braavos and Pentos returned with not just gold and exotic luxuries, but ideas and innovations that slowly began transforming northern society. Yet for all his success in matters of governance and diplomacy, Ned never forgot the fundamental responsibility that came with his bloodline. The wall still stood, and the Night's Watch still maintained their ancient vigil against threats that most of the realm had forgotten. Regular supplies of food, weapons, and warm clothing flowed north from Winterfell, while young men who chose the Black received the Lord of Winterfell's personal blessing, along with practical support for their new lives. The relationship with the Watch went deeper than mere obligation, reflecting Ned's genuine understanding of the existential threat they guarded against. His conversations with Lord Commander Jon Mormont revealed a shared awareness that the ancient enemy had not been destroyed, merely contained, and that the peace the realm enjoyed could be shattered if vigilance ever faltered. The decision to send his bastard son to the Watch was motivated partly by this understanding, offering Jon a chance to find honor and purpose while strengthening the bonds between Winterfell and Castle Black. Family relationships during this period reflected both the warmth that genuine affection could create and the tensions that arose from secrets that could never be fully shared. Catelyn's obvious discomfort with Jon's presence was a constant source of domestic friction, yet Ned's refusal to explain or justify his decision created a gap in their marriage that could never be completely bridged. The children caught between these adult complexities learned to navigate family dynamics that prepared them for the harsh realities they would eventually face. The education Ned provided his children reflected his own hard-won understanding of what leadership required. Military training was balanced with lessons in history and law, while practical experience in governance came through direct participation in the daily administration of Winterfell. Each child learned that privilege came with responsibility, that the Stark name carried obligations that extended far beyond personal desires or ambitions. The reputation Ned built throughout the 7 kingdoms during his years as Lord of Winterfell would ultimately prove both his greatest asset and his fatal vulnerability. The respect he commanded from every major house was based on their certainty that his word could be trusted absolutely, that he would never break an oath or abandon a friend regardless of the personal cost. Yet this same inflexibility would leave him poorly equipped to navigate the treacherous waters of King's Landing politics when duty finally called him south. The man who had rebuilt the North from the ashes of rebellion, who had earned the fierce loyalty of his bannermen and the genuine affection of his family, who had proven that honor and effective leadership were not mutually exclusive, would soon face challenges that no amount of personal integrity could overcome. The approaching crisis would test every principle he held dear and demand choices that no honorable man should ever have to make. The raven that brought news of Jon Arryn's death to Winterfell carried with it the end of an era, though Ned Stark could not have known the full implications of what that simple message meant. The man who had been like a second father to him, who had shaped his understanding of honor and duty during those crucial years at the Eyrie, was gone. With his passing, the careful balance of power that had maintained stability in the Seven Kingdoms began to shift in ways that would ultimately destroy everything Ned held dear. King Robert's journey north to Winterfell was the first time that two friends had seen each other in years, and the differences between them had become impossible to ignore. Where Ned remained much the same man who had fought beside Robert during the rebellion, the king had been transformed by power and indulgence into something his old friend barely recognized. The warrior who had wielded his warhammer with legendary skill had become a corpulent shadow of his former self, drowning his disappointments in wine and seeking meaning in pleasures that left him increasingly hollow. Yet beneath Robert's bluster and apparent carelessness lay a desperation that Ned was perhaps the only person in the kingdom capable of recognizing. The crown was drowning in debt. The queen despised her husband openly, and the realm showed signs of the corruption that inevitably arose when leadership focused on personal gratification rather than public service. Robert's offer of the hand's position to Ned was as much a plea for salvation as it was an honor bestowed on an old friend. The crypts of Winterfell, where Robert knelt before Lyanna's tomb and wept for the girl he claimed to love, held truths that neither man could speak aloud. Ned's knowledge of what had really happened at the Tower of Joy created an unbridgeable gulf between them, a secret so profound that it poisoned every interaction despite their mutual affection. The promise he had made to his dying sister bound him to silence even as it destroyed any possibility of the honest friendship they had once shared. Accepting the position of hand meant abandoning everything that had made Ned's life meaningful for the past 15 years. Winterfell would continue without him, managed by Catelyn's competent administration and the loyal service of bannermen who had learned to function independently. But leaving the North meant entering a world he was fundamentally unprepared for, where honor was weakness and truth was whatever served immediate political needs. The journey south revealed just how much the Seven Kingdoms had changed during the years of Ned's absence from courtly politics. The prosperity that peace had brought to most regions masked underlying tensions that threatened to tear the realm apart. Great houses maneuvered for advantage through marriage alliances and trade agreements, while the common people bore the burden of taxes that funded royal extravagance rather than necessary governance. King's Landing itself was a revelation of corruption that shocked even Ned's cynical expectations. The city that should have been the shining center of royal power had become a cesspit of competing ambitions, where every conversation carried hidden meanings and every gesture might conceal a threat. The small council meetings that consumed his days were exercises in manipulation and misdirection, where the kingdom's genuine needs were subordinated to the personal interests of those wielding power. The investigation into Jon Arryn's death began almost immediately, though Ned approached it with the methodical patience that had served him well in governing the North. The clues were subtle but persistent, leading him through a labyrinth of financial records and genealogical research that gradually revealed the explosive truth about the royal succession. The realization that none of Robert's supposed children actually carried his blood was devastating enough, but the implications went far beyond simple adultery. Cersei Lannister's relationship with her twin brother Jaime represented a violation of every natural law and social custom that held the realm together. More practically, it meant that the Iron Throne's heir was a bastard with no legitimate claim to power, a situation that would inevitably lead to civil war when Robert died and the truth became public knowledge. The web of lies that had protected this secret was beginning to unravel, and Ned found himself holding information that could destroy kingdoms. The confrontation with Cersei in the Godswood of the Red Keep was perhaps the most crucial conversation of Ned's life, though he failed to recognize its importance until it was too late. His decision to give the Queen warning, to offer her the chance to flee with her children rather than face Robert's inevitable wrath, demonstrated the fundamental decency that had always guided his actions, yet it also revealed his fatal inability to understand that mercy could be perceived as weakness by those who lived entirely without conscience. Robert's death during the hunting expedition eliminated the last restraint on the forces that had been building toward open conflict. The king, who might have been able to navigate the crisis through sheer force of personality, was gone, replaced by a child whose claim to the throne was fraudulent and whose supporters were willing to commit any atrocity to maintain their power. The final confrontation in the throne room played out exactly as anyone familiar with Lannister methods should have expected. Littlefinger's betrayal was both inevitable and shocking, the logical conclusion of a relationship that Ned had never properly understood. The man who had loved Catelyn Stark with obsessive devotion saw her husband's destruction as both personal revenge and political opportunity, a chance to reshape the power structure of the Seven Kingdoms according to his own twisted vision. The gold that bought the City Watcher's loyalty represented just another transaction in a game where Ned had never learned the rules. The imprisonment that followed was perhaps worse than death itself for a man whose entire identity was built around personal agency and moral authority. The black cells beneath the Red Keep were designed to break spirits as well as bodies, and the isolation gave Ned ample time to contemplate the catastrophic failure of everything he had tried to achieve. The knowledge that his actions had not just destroyed himself but endangered everyone he loved was a torment that no physical suffering could match. The negotiations over his fate revealed the impossible position that honor had created for him. Confessing to treason meant accepting public humiliation and the complete destruction of his reputation, acknowledging crimes he had never committed in order to save daughters who were being held hostage by his enemies. Yet the alternative was watching Sansa and Arya pay the price for their father's inflexibility, a cost that no principle was worth accepting. The decision to confess represented the complete victory of love over pride, the final demonstration that Ned Stark's honor was not the rigid adherence to abstract principles that his enemies claimed it was. The man who stood before the great sept of Baelor and spoke words that condemned him as a traitor was making the ultimate sacrifice for his family, choosing their survival over his own moral purity. The crowd that jeered at his confession had no understanding of the courage such surrender required. Joffrey's decision to demand execution despite the promised mercy was the final proof that madness had infected the Iron Throne just as completely as it had during the reign of Aerys Targaryen. The boy king who countermanded his mother's careful arrangements demonstrated the same casual cruelty and complete disregard for political consequences that had ultimately destroyed the previous dynasty. The parallel was lost on no one who witnessed the scene, though none dared speak such thoughts aloud. The sword that took Ned Stark's head was ice, the ancient Valyrian steel blade that had served his family for generations. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel, using the Stark ancestral weapon to destroy the last Lord of Winterfell while his daughters watched in horror. The act was not just murder but desecration, a violation of every tradition that had bound the Seven Kingdoms together since the conquest. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed just how catastrophically the Lannisters had miscalculated the political implications of their actions. The North exploded into open rebellion as bannermen who had followed Ned Stark through decades of just governance refused to accept his judicial murder. the Riverlands joined the revolt, bringing with them the resources and strategic position that would make the northern cause viable. Most importantly, the moral authority that came from seeking justice for such an obvious atrocity attracted support from unexpected quarters throughout the realm. Yet the greatest tragedy was not political but personal, the destruction of a family that had weathered every crisis for 8,000 years, only to be scattered by the machinations of southern lords who mistook cunning for wisdom. The children who should have grown up safely in Winterfell's halls were instead thrust into a world of violence and uncertainty, forced to develop survival skills that no child should ever need to learn. The ravens that carried news of Ned Stark's execution to every corner of the north flew through skies that seemed to darken with each mile they traveled. At Winterfell, the great bell tolled for hours as the reality of what had happened in King's Landing sank into the consciousness of a realm that had never imagined such treachery was possible. The Lord of Winterfell was dead, murdered by a boy king who had promised mercy, and with his death came the end of any hope that the crisis consuming the Seven Kingdoms could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. Robb Stark's transformation from adolescent heir to wartime leader happened with startling rapidity, driven by necessity and the fierce loyalty of bannermen who would not accept their lord's murder without response. At 15, he possessed neither his father's experience nor his uncle Brandon's natural charisma, but he carried something perhaps more valuable in the circumstances that confronted him. The rage of youth, tempered by the stark sense of justice, created a combination of moral authority and tactical flexibility that would prove devastatingly effective against enemies who expected conventional political calculations. The host that gathered at Winterfell represented the largest military force the North had assembled since the days of the Kings of Winter. 20,000 men answered the call, from the greybeards of the mountain clans to the young knights of White Harbor, all united by their determination to see justice done for the man who had ruled them with wisdom and honor. The sight of so many banners flying together should have been cause for celebration, but the circumstances that had necessitated such a gathering cast a shadow over even the most stirring displays of northern solidarity. The march south began with a grim purpose that distinguished it from every previous northern military expedition. These men were not marching to support the Iron Throne or fulfill feudal obligations to their royal overlords. They were seeking vengeance against the very institutions that had governed the Seven Kingdoms for 3 centuries, determined to extract payment for betrayals that had violated every principle of honorable conduct. The songs that would later celebrate their campaigns could not capture the cold fury that drove them through the Riverlands toward their destiny. The Battle of the Whispering Wood became the first demonstration of the tactical genius that would make Robb Stark's reputation throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The plan that lured Jaime Lannister's forces into the trap was sophisticated beyond anything that should have been possible for such a young commander, combining deception, timing, and intimate knowledge of terrain to achieve complete surprise. When the Northern cavalry charged out of the darkness, they were not just winning a battle but announcing that the war had truly begun. Jaime Lannister's capture represented a triumph that went far beyond its immediate tactical value. The man who had earned the epithet Kingslayer through his murder of Aerys Targaryen was perhaps the most formidable warrior in the Seven Kingdoms, and his presence in northern hands provided leverage that could potentially be used to secure the release of Ned's daughters. More importantly, his defeat demonstrated that the Lannister military reputation was not invincible, encouraging other enemies of the regime to believe that victory was actually possible. The subsequent campaign through the Westerlands revealed the strategic vision that made Robb's military leadership so effective. Rather than simply besieging strongholds or fighting the kind of conventional battles that would favor the enemy's superior resources, the northern forces struck at the economic foundation that supported Lannister power. Gold mines were seized or destroyed, trade routes were severed, and the carefully constructed infrastructure that had made the Western Kingdoms wealthy was systematically dismantled. The Battle of Oxcross became the perfect example of this approach, combining rapid movement with precise intelligence to achieve objectives that conventional wisdom said were impossible. The destruction of the Lannister camp was so complete that survivors struggled to explain how northern forces had appeared seemingly from nowhere, struck with devastating effectiveness, and vanished before any organized response could be mounted. The psychological impact of such victories often proved more valuable than their immediate military consequences. Yet it was in the political realm that Robb's youth and inexperience began to show most clearly. The proclamation that made him king in the north was emotionally satisfying and historically justified, but it also committed him to objectives that could not be achieved through military means alone. Independence for the North required not just defeating Lannister forces in battle, but fundamentally restructuring the political relationships that had bound the Seven Kingdoms together since the conquest. The northern lords who crowned their young king in the ruins of Riverrun were motivated by genuine loyalty and righteous anger, but they also demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the challenges that lay ahead. Declaring independence was the easy part. Maintaining it against the combined resources of the southern kingdoms would require diplomatic skills and strategic patience that no one in the northern leadership possessed. The enthusiasm that carried them through the early victories would prove insufficient when the initial momentum was lost. Catelyn Stark's release of Jaime Lannister represented both the desperate action of a mother, fearing for her daughters, and a catastrophic failure of political judgment that undermined everything her son had achieved. The decision was understandable on a human level, but devastating in its strategic implications. Trading away the most valuable bargaining chip the Northern cause possessed, for promises that everyone should have known the Lannisters would never honor. The division it created within the Northern leadership would prove impossible to heal. The fractures in the alliance became increasingly apparent as the war dragged on and the costs mounted without any clear resolution in sight. Houses that had initially supported the cause with enthusiasm began questioning whether the objectives were worth the sacrifices being demanded. The independence that had seemed like an achievable goal in the aftermath of Ned's execution began to look more like a romantic fantasy that was consuming the strength of the North without offering any realistic path to success. Robb's marriage to Talisa Maegor, while personally fulfilling, represented the final collapse of the political discipline that effective leadership required. The decision to follow his heart rather than his duty destroyed the crucial alliance with House Frey that controlled the strategic crossing at the Twins. More fundamentally, it demonstrated that even the most promising young leaders could be undone by their inability to subordinate personal desires to the greater good of their cause. The Red Wedding was the inevitable culmination of a strategy based on emotion rather than calculation, though its specific brutality exceeded anything that even cynical observers had expected. The violation of guest right that allowed the massacre was not just a war crime, but a blasphemy against the fundamental laws that held civilization together. The sight of Robb Stark's body with Grey Wind's head sewn onto it was designed to send a message that would discourage any future challenges to Lannister authority. Yet the massacre that was intended to end Northern resistance instead transformed it into something far more dangerous to the established order. The scattered survivors who escaped the Twins carried with them not just news of the atrocity, but a burning desire for vengeance that would outlast any political settlement. The phrase "the North remembers" became more than a rallying cry. It became a promise of retribution that would haunt the perpetrators for years to come. The immediate aftermath of the Red Wedding saw the collapse of organized Northern resistance, but it also created the conditions for a different kind of warfare that would prove even more difficult for the Lannisters to combat. Individual houses began pursuing their own vendettas, while common soldiers who had survived the massacre formed irregular units that struck at enemy supply lines and isolated garrisons. The war had been transformed from a conventional conflict between armies into a struggle for the very soul of the North. The installation of Roose Bolton as Warden of the North represented the Lannisters' attempt to provide their conquest with a facade of legitimacy, but it also demonstrated their fundamental misunderstanding of how Northern society actually functioned. The loyalty that bound the great houses to Winterfell was based on generations of mutual respect and shared sacrifice, bonds that could not be transferred to a new ruler simply through royal decree. The Bolton regime would prove to be built on foundations of sand, maintained only through terror and destined to collapse the moment effective opposition emerged. The scattering of the Stark children marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new chapter in the family's long history. Each of the surviving siblings would face their own trials and develop their own understanding of what it meant to carry the wolf's blood in a world that had become far more dangerous than their protected childhoods had prepared them for. Their individual journeys would ultimately converge in ways that would reshape not just the North but the entire structure of power in Westeros. In the aftermath of the Red Wedding, the surviving children of Ned Stark found themselves scattered across a continent that had become hostile to everything their family name represented. Each would be forced to navigate a world that seemed designed to destroy them, developing skills and strength their privileged upbringing had never required. Their individual journeys through darkness would ultimately lead them back to each other and to the home that had always called to their hearts, but the children who reunited at Winterfell would be vastly different from those who had left it years earlier. Arya Stark's transformation from highborn lady to lethal assassin began the moment she fled the Red Keep during her father's execution. The girl who had once struggled with needlework and courtly manners discovered reserves of determination and adaptability that allowed her to survive in circumstances that would have destroyed most adults. Her journey through the war-torn Riverlands was a brutal education in the realities of power, teaching her that survival often required abandoning the moral certainties that had once seemed absolute. The months she spent serving as cupbearer to Tywin Lannister at Harrenhal represented perhaps the most surreal period of her entire odyssey. Standing mere feet from the man who had orchestrated her family's destruction, serving him wine while listening to his plans for ending Northern resistance, required a level of self-control that few adults could have maintained. Yet these experiences also taught her invaluable lessons about the nature of power and the vulnerabilities that even the most formidable enemies possessed. Her time with the Hound created an unlikely bond between two damaged souls who found in each other something approaching family despite their superficial antagonism. Sandor Clegane's gruff protection and harsh wisdom provided Arya with both physical safety and psychological preparation for the even greater challenges that awaited her. Their relationship demonstrated that in a world where traditional loyalties had collapsed, human connections could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. The journey to Braavos and the House of Black and White marked Arya's transition from survivor to predator, though the training she received from the faceless men nearly cost her the very identity she was fighting to preserve. The mystical assassins who served the many-faced god offered her power beyond anything she could have imagined, but at the price of becoming no one, abandoning every connection to the girl she had once been. Her ultimate rejection of their philosophy represented not failure but the triumph of Stark identity over even the most seductive alternatives. The return to Westeros brought with it opportunities for the vengeance that had sustained her through years of suffering and training. The extermination of House Freysey was executed with a precision and thoroughness that demonstrated just how completely she had mastered the skills of death, but it also revealed that revenge, however satisfying, could not restore what had been lost. The girl who had dreamed of killing her enemies discovered that achieving such dreams left her feeling empty rather than fulfilled. Sansa Stark's education in the brutal realities of political power began with her betrothal to Joffrey and continued through years of captivity and manipulation that would have broken a weaker spirit. Her survival in King's Landing required learning to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of compliance, developing the ability to endure humiliation and cruelty while preserving some core of selfhood that could not be destroyed by external circumstances. The marriage to Tyrion Lannister, while personally distasteful, also provided her with an unlikely protector, whose own outsider status within his family created a strange alliance between two people who should have been natural enemies. Their relationship demonstrated that even in the most cynical political arrangements, genuine human decency could sometimes emerge to provide comfort and protection for the vulnerable. Her escape from King's Landing with Littlefinger began what she initially believed would be liberation, but proved to be simply a different form of captivity. Petyr Baelish's obsession with her mother had created a twisted devotion that was perhaps more dangerous than open hostility, as his manipulation was disguised as protection and his schemes were presented as opportunities for advancement. Learning to navigate his web of lies and half-truths provided invaluable preparation for the even greater challenges that awaited her. The marriage to Ramsay Bolton represented the nadir of Sansa's suffering, subjecting her to physical and psychological torments that would have destroyed anyone who had not already been hardened by years of abuse. Yet even this nightmare served a purpose in her development, teaching her that survival was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances, and that patience could be more powerful than immediate resistance. The strength she discovered during those dark months would prove crucial in everything that followed. Bran Stark's fall from Winterfell's tower had ended his dreams of knighthood, but opened pathways to powers that transcended anything mere martial prowess could offer. His journey beyond the wall in search of the three-eyed raven was both a physical odyssey through the most dangerous wilderness in the known world, and a spiritual quest to understand abilities that connected him to forces older than human civilization. The revelations that awaited him in the cave of the three-eyed raven transformed not just his understanding of his own capabilities, but his perception of history itself. The ability to see through time, to witness events that had occurred millennia in the past, and glimpse possibilities that might emerge in the future, came with the terrible burden of knowledge that could not be shared and responsibilities that could not be avoided. His discovery of Jon Snow's true parentage represented perhaps the most politically significant revelation in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, information that would ultimately determine the fate of dynasties and reshape the very nature of royal authority. Yet the knowledge came with understanding that truth alone was insufficient without the wisdom to know when and how such information should be revealed. Jon Snow's journey from bastard to king was perhaps the most unlikely transformation of any Stark child, yet it was also the most thoroughly grounded in the traditional values that had always defined their family. His decision to join the Night's Watch was motivated by a desire to find purpose and honor outside the limitations that his birth had imposed, but it led him into confrontations with threats that tested every principle he held dear. The relationship with the wildlings forced him to question assumptions about honor and duty that he had never previously examined. Learning that the traditional enemies of the Night's Watch were human beings with their own legitimate concerns required a flexibility of thinking that his upbringing had not encouraged, yet it also opened possibilities for alliances that could benefit all the peoples of the North. His assassination by his own brothers was the ultimate test of his commitment to doing what he believed was right, regardless of personal consequences. The decision to allow the wildlings south of the Wall had been unpopular but necessary, and his willingness to die for that choice demonstrated the same fundamental integrity that had characterized his father's leadership. The resurrection that followed was not just a return to life, but a transformation that freed him from the oaths that had bound him to the Night's Watch. The man who returned from death carried with him a clarity of purpose that would prove essential in the challenges that lay ahead, though it came at the cost of something essentially human that could never be fully restored. The reunion of the Stark siblings at Winterfell was both a homecoming and a recognition of how profoundly they had all been changed by their respective ordeals. The children who embraced in the castle's courtyard were barely recognizable as the family that had been torn apart by war and treachery, yet beneath their scars and hard-won wisdom lay bonds that no amount of suffering had been able to break. The Battle of the Bastards that restored Stark rule to Winterfell was won not through superior numbers or better strategy, but through the intervention of allies whose loyalty had been earned through years of honorable conduct and mutual respect. The Vale Knights, who arrived at the crucial moment, represented more than military reinforcement. They demonstrated that the Stark reputation for integrity had created relationships that endured even when all seemed lost. The final confrontation with the Night King and his army of the dead fulfilled the ancient prophecy that had brought the Stark bloodline into existence 8,000 years earlier. The battle was won not through conventional military might, but through the mystical abilities that the family had always carried, powers that connected them to the very foundations of the world they sought to protect. The aftermath of victory brought with it choices that would have seemed impossible to contemplate during the dark years of exile and suffering. Sansa's decision to declare northern independence reflected not just personal ambition, but genuine understanding of what her people needed to heal from the wounds that decades of southern politics had inflicted. Jon's exile beyond the Wall was both punishment and liberation, allowing him to find peace in the wild lands that had always called to his spirit. The Stark restoration was complete, but it had come at a cost that could never be fully calculated. The family that had endured for 8 millennia had been broken and reformed in ways that would echo through whatever ages lay ahead. Yet in their survival and triumph, they had proven once again that winter could be endured, that honor could overcome treachery, and that the wolves of Winterfell would always find their way home.